I'm going to talk to you about how to quote sources using the sandwiching method and also using MLA style citations. First question you want to ask yourself is, do I really need a quote? Because your first choice should always be to put things in your own words. But there are times where you do really need a quote. For example, if you're quoting a line of poetry or a piece of dialogue, or if it's something from a source you've researched that is so eloquently said that if you put it in your own words, it would ruin it. So if you've decided a quote is necessary, the other thing you should do is ask yourself, how short can I make it? And you want to make the quote as short as possible, just as little that is necessary to make your point. Oftentimes in academic writing, we might even quote a fragment of a sentence and not even the whole sentence. What you want to avoid when using quotes is what's called the hit and run, or it's sometimes called the quotation bomb. And what you see on the screen here is an example of that. We've got a quote with quotation marks that just comes out of nowhere. We don't know who's talking, what the context is, why they're saying it. It's very confusing and disorienting to a reader. And the sentence afterwards, the second sentence, that's also, it's kind of related to that quote maybe, but it's not clear. We haven't really connected the dots for the reader of how those ideas are related. Don't do that. What you want to do is what's called this quotation sandwich. So this is a metaphor for what we're doing, the sandwich imagery. Notice in the middle you've got the quote, and it's got all that meat and tomatoes and mayonnaise and whatever. But around the meat, the quote, you want to have an introduction, like the top piece of bread, and an explanation in your own words, like the bottom piece of bread. So to introduce the quote, we use a strategy called narrative citation. Sometimes this is also called signal phrase or tagline. One example of how to do that is to use an author's last name. For example, I have on the screen Brown. But sometimes if you don't have an author's name available, or if it's not actually the author who's talking, you might use phrases like, for example, the researchers, or NASA's website, or Gallup poll. If you're using a narrative citation with the author's name, which is pretty common, there's a whole big set of verbs you can rely on that will help you with that narrative citation. Right here I have 5 common ones that are used in academic writing, but if you Google like narrative citation verbs, you'll find a much larger list. And the other thing I recommend doing is that when you're reading other people's academic writing, notice the kinds of verbs they use and the kind of narrative citation phrases they use, and see if you like them and see if they work, and notice which ones seem to work well. Okay, here's an example of a sandwich quotation. What I have in yellow here is like the top bread of the sandwich. It's introducing the fact that this quote comes from the Gonzalez article, and that it's coming from a study participant in the Gonzalez study who says these things that are in quotation marks that are kind of interesting. Way of putting things about not being able to afford to get a computer fixed. That's the meat of the sandwich, the quote, the cool stuff. At the end here, we have a sentence that explains what that student was saying and how it's relevant to the larger point that the essay is making. So that quotation is put in between an introduction and a little analysis or explanation after the fact. The last thing I want to ask you to pay attention to is how we've done this in MLA style. MLA requires that you use an author's name. And when you have the author's name in a narrative citation like that, you don't need to put it in the citation at the end of the sentence. That 241 that we see there, that's the page number. That's all MLA wants, is the page number if it's available. If there's no page number, like if this came from just a web source that has no pages, then you just leave that off. But notice where the parentheses are in relation to the quote, and also how there's a period after that final parenthesis.